Uncle agradecimento por simplesmente dinanya pagna hani then lokisitita pokok todo tempo no manazita como mangaigan para wato linguagem todo samzini mangaigi gwini sus masini tempo mizo anzul que ni mane como no sus masi por tempo mizo era interesse mizo ni para em hingo tama para den sangan pagna hani Tanane laki danklina smasi toril jisai man participar gi man malofansa na experiment sa ginin enna itsu mizu gini luta tinenza saipan ni mangaigan pagu gini para ta presenta di puri snedda gini na studio za mamalagan para wahadi didi no bisangan kini Chamorro ki puri esta presentação express ni no pinatizini fino inglês certo não é que dão com experimentos e tanto Chung e Dr. Manny F University of California Santa Cruz por interesse niya dentro de niya ni para mausay linguagem Chamorro para manafama número que siya man scientist que tano por linguagita a introduzir fino Chamorro viena na lugar sa universidade no saya samna man cecegesti na tsotso ja bog sumasira sa saipan ja pur malago hamna para ulibiano mona i tantos mami guaha intigi ja sedi ham pa ben tai presentation mami ha todo situmungo na guaha diferencia siha linguagem tal como que taimano e tal documentos zangena usa a linguagem para que taimano e tal to compreende e hafa masasangan a linguagem estudio por diferenciação na usa a linguagem popodong estudio ni magan social linguistics gini social linguistics assim ta identifica bola na siha na diferentes classes tiningo por mausa a linguagem Wahana biyahe na diferensya ke linguagem ginin sigun gi lugar ni sumastiga e como quantos. Por exemplo, itauto ni sumastiga luta, haluk lemai, ja itauto ni sumastiga tinian jan saipan haluk lemai. Giocho na maneira, wahana biyahe na diferensya ke linguagem era por sigun gi idade, itauto. Por exemplo, ilam ko na fifino Chamorro sinaha usay palavra nieto. Zaila hobin na fino Chamorro, na fifino Chamorro sinaha usay palavra grant no lugar de nieto. Lao enfim, guahana biyahe na i diferença de linguagem tipo segundo gimano ni sumastiga i tauto, pa segundo i idade tauto. Na era pot man diferenciar i tauto siha, por exemplo, guahana fifino Chamorro, usay palavra la lolo. Guahana fifino Chamorro, usay palavra na lolo, pat lokwe na nolo. Tisinya taalo na itauto ni usay palavra na nolo, pat la lolo, era ganin luta, gitagwihi na manera na isinya taalo na itauto ni halo lamay, ganin luta, pat gitagwihi na manera na isinya taalo na itauto ni halo nieto, era tihobin lo lang ko na tauto. Esta sia na diferença que halo ni linguagem, man tinetica put taimano mausa e palavra, zan taimano ma pronuncia e palavra. Esta sia na diferença que todo linguagem gitano. Pago na haani, man malagohan para bem presenta didi, por diferença sia que sinangan ifino Chamorro. Gitamano na maneira na gua diferença que palavra para Gimasangan ni palavra, guago halo que diferença de sinangan para de que empreendem de sinangan de sentença siha. Desta na ponto para bem apresenta vini a segundo experiment em jagi que mamalofansa na mesa mapus kasakan. Una narração na inchete este na estudo que foi Chamorro por hengi na sinha manina mas que empreende por taimano linguagem mausa zan ma comprende no e tauto sia gitano. E outro narração era por afanuno e taimano e man fifino Chamorro mausa zan ma comprende e fino Chamorro Italili na differences siya kasi hanaihit masculine friendly but masculine friendly could irinikon ifinut Chamorro. Dan lokpisina manajuda ifinanagin finut Chamorro.
Okay, I'm going to repeat in English what Manny just said in Chamorro. Everyone knows that there's language variation. That is, there are differences in how people speak or understand the same language. The study of language variation is called sociolinguistics. And we can identify many types of variation. Sometimes language variation is linked to where a person is from. For instance, people from Rota say lemai to mean breadfruit, but people from Tinian and Saipan say lemmai. Other times, language variation is related to a person's age. For example, an older speaker of Chamorro might use the word nietu to talk about their grandson, but a younger speaker is more likely to say grand. Still other times, language variation is not connected to any group, but it's just a difference among individuals, just something that makes one person different from another person. So some Chamorro say lalalu for the word that means to be angry. Other people say nalalu, or even nalanu, nanalu. As far as we can tell, saying lalalu versus nanalu doesn't identify the speaker as belonging to any group. In the same way that saying lemai can identify a speaker as being from Rota, or saying nietu can identify the speaker as older. Now, all these types of language variation that we've just talked about involve words and how they're pronounced. And that's no accident. Variation in words and how they're pronounced is found in every language of the world. Today, we want to talk about some types of language variation that occur in sentences in Chamorro and how people understand them. Just like words or sounds, sentences can differ in the way that they are produced or understood, depending on where the speaker grew up, how old the speaker is, or other factors. One of the reasons why we study the Chamorro language is that we think it can help to answer questions about how language is used and understood by all human beings. Another reason is that this research teaches us about how different speakers use the Chamorro language. These differences can perhaps give us some insight into the richness of the language and into what could be emphasized when the language is taught. So let me move on to give an example of language variation in Chamorro sentences. So here's our first example. There are different ways of asking questions in Chamorro about who owns or has something. For instance, to say, whose truck did you paint in Chamorro, you could say, "Ojigai truck kun penta?" Literally, who has a truck that you painted? Or "Ojian penta oji truck niya?" Who'd you paint a truck for? Or "Ojian penta truck niya?" Who did you paint his truck? In the experiment that we did here in 2011, we learned that many younger speakers of Chamorro had trouble understanding questions like the last question. The younger a speaker was, the more likely they were to interpret the question, "Ojian penta truck niya?" as meaning the same as "Ojian penta?" Who did you paint? Which is a question that doesn't make very much sense. So this made us wonder whether there are other types of sentences that younger speakers of Chamorro have trouble with, and whether this is one of the ways in which the Chamorro language is being lost across the generations. We know that in some languages that are very close to death, or dying, speakers tend to know only very simple sentence types. They don't tend to know the more complex sentence types. So for this reason, we wanted to know about variation in another type of complex sentence in Chamorro. And those are sentences with relative clauses. A relative clause is a type of sentence, actually it's a type of embedded sentence that provides more information about a noun. So for instance, on this slide, you can see there are pictures of several different men, actually 5 different men, and we can use the word lahi to talk about any of them. But suppose you wanted to draw my attention to a specific man, the one that the blue arrow is pointing to now. One of the things you could do is use a relative clause. you might say, Atan Nalahi Igumugu Yajuju. Meaning, look at that man who is holding the coconut crab. Those words, Igumugu Yajuju, form a relative clause, a sentence that provides more information about the lahi. When you hear the relative clause, you know which man is being talked about. He's the one that's holding the coconut crab. In Chamorro, a relative clause can combine with the noun it modifies in several different ways. Some relative clauses follow the noun they modify, like the example we just used, in which Igumugu Iajuju follows Edzunalahi. Other relative clauses precede the noun they modify. For instance, in our example, you might also have said, Ata nedzu edzi gumuguut iadzujunalahi, meaning, okay, look at that man who's holding the coconut crab. Finally, a relative clause in Chamorro can also modify a noun that is not pronounced at all. We call these headless relative clauses. So you might have said, Ata nedzi gumuguut iadzuju. Look at that one who is holding the coconut crab. Notice Chamorro has these three types of relative clauses, but English only has one type, the type where the relative clause follows the noun that it modifies. So in English we can only say, look at the man who's holding the crab.
Great. So the fact that Chamorro has these three relative clause types instead of English, which just has one, gives us a point of variation, and that leads us to ask our first question. How do speakers treat these three different types of relative clauses? Do they regard them as kind of the same, or do they prefer one over the other? So for this very first simple question, we think the answer is yes. We think that most speakers prefer the relative clauses that follow the noun, the one that I've highlighted in green. Relative clauses like this are heard more often in Chamorro conversations. They're found more often in books written in Chamorro and blogs, for example. And in the question period, we'd be interested to see if you agree with us or if you have some observations. But so maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into how relative clauses can vary between speakers. So we'll talk about ambiguity. Some relative clauses have more than one meaning. They can be understood in more than one way, and this is what we mean when we say it's ambiguous. So for example, we can try a new sentence like Edzunalahi achichikui pakun. Here the relative clause achichikui pakun can mean that the man is kissing the child, as shown in our picture, or that the child is kissing the man. So in the first meaning, lahi is the subject, and in the second meaning, lahi is the object. Okay? So this leads to our second question about language variation. When relative clauses or any construction in the language have more than one possible meaning, which meaning do speakers prefer? Now, we did some experiments here in September of 2013 and in June of 2014, and we found that speakers strongly prefer relative clauses in which the noun is the subject, but this preference depends on word order. So that would be like the example on the left. So I'll show you one graph from our study. So this is just a bar graph, and on the vertical axis we show the number of times people thought that sentence Edzunalahi achichikui pakun meant that the man was kissing the child, right? And it's close to, but not exactly 100%. If it were 100%, we wouldn't say that the sentence is ambiguous. But there are some speakers, maybe 10%, who thought it could mean the other thing. But basically, almost everyone understands that the man is the one who's doing the kissing. It's sort of shown there in the bar graph. That's the preferred interpretation of that picture. However, when the relative clause precedes the noun, speakers' intuitions flip, and they prefer the object meaning. So in Edzui achichikui pekunalahi, many people understand that the child is doing the kissing. Notice that this green bar is closer to 50%, so it's not as strong of a preference, but more speakers tend to prefer the object meaning for that version of the relative clause. Okay, so this so far so good, but interestingly, we found that this difference is related to what island the speaker is from. When the relative clause precedes the noun, as in the green version, speakers from Rota prefer the meaning in which the noun is the object more often than speakers from Saipan. So I'll turn the graph on its side, and so here you can see speakers from Rota in a sentence like edzui chichikui pakun na lahi, they tend to think that the lahi is the object, that is the person being kissed, like 30% of the time. I'm sorry, 70% of the time, yeah. But speakers from Saipan, they tend to more think, oh, actually, the lahi is the one doing the kissing. And speakers from Tinian, even more so. So even speakers from different islands interpret this ambiguity, the fact that there are two meanings to the sentence, in different ways. Stepping back for a second, this suggests a reason why the Chamorro language allows all this variation. Why should it allow relative clauses to follow or to precede the noun? So even though speakers prefer the relative clauses that follow the noun, they may use the relative clauses that precede the noun when they want to hear or to understand that the noun is the object. So we've asked about differences between speakers from different islands who grew up speaking slightly different varieties of Chamorro. What about younger speakers? Do younger speakers differ from older speakers here? And remember, we were interested in this question because the relative clause is a kind of complex sentence, and we know that complex sentences might be something that varies among younger speakers. Interestingly, the answer is no here. Younger speakers and older speakers behave exactly alike with respect to the 2 points I just mentioned. So in this graph, you can notice that each point is a speaker group of a different age. The leftmost points correspond to young speakers, like speakers from 20 to 32, and the rightmost points correspond to older speakers, speakers 55 to 70. Notice that when we look at Edzunalahi Chichigui Pakun, the following order, both younger speakers and older speakers behave basically the same. Those two, it's basically a straight blue line. Likewise, in Edzui Chichigui Pakun Lahi, it's basically a straight green line. That's pretty interesting that younger speakers and older speakers treat these ambiguities the same way. Okay. So our final point for today, our final question of variation. We said that some relative clauses can follow or precede the noun they modify. We also said that some relative clauses have more than one meaning. Fortunately, Chamorro can use affixes to make the meaning of the relative clause clear and unambiguous, right? So we can change the form of the word. For example, so let's start with our basic example of Edzunalahi Chichikui Pakun. When the infix in and the nominalization are used together on a transitive verb and a relative clause, the noun is always the object. So in Edzunalahi Chinikukunya Ipakun, right? We lose one of those meanings. Almost everyone understands from chinikukunya, that the form of the verb chiku, that the man is the one who's being kissed, right? So this leads to our third question about language variation. Does this special morphology, right, the difference between chiku and chinikukunya, make it easier for speakers to understand the relative clause? In the experiment we did here in September 2013, we found that the answer was yes. Speakers almost always understood a relative clause like Edzunalahi Chinikukunya Ipakun to mean that the man is the one who is being kissed. So here, if you notice, what you'll notice is you see all these red bars, and the lower they are, the more speakers think it can only have that object meaning. So you see they're all very low, they're almost all below 10%. Very few speakers make a mistake with this one. However, let's ask our question that we asked before. Do younger speakers differ from older speakers? Here the answer turns out to be yes. So the younger speakers are the leftmost bar, and you can notice that they are making more mistakes. You know, whereas most speakers are under 10%, the younger speakers are above 10%. They're at like 25 or 30%. Speakers aged 20 to 32 understand the noun to be the subject of the relative clause rather than the object. But almost everyone over 32 understands the noun in these relative clauses to be the object. What explains this difference? The first possibility that we thought about, and maybe the first idea that might come to your mind, is that younger speakers simply don't know the meaning of the infix in plus nominalization. That is, they simply don't understand that this special morphology means that the noun is the object. This can't be right, it turns out. In headless relative clauses, the one where you sort of drop nalahi at the end, when the noun is not pronounced, younger speakers behave exactly like older speakers. They always understand the noun to be the object. So here's a table of just the oldest speakers and the youngest speakers, and the three different relative clause types we talked about. Edzunalahi chinikukunye ipakun, so that's where it follows, or edzui chinikukunye ipakun alahi, where it precedes, or edzui chinikukunye ipakun, where we don't mention the lahi. You can see that the younger speakers in the 20 to 32 column make a lot of errors, 47%, 28%. But when you leave out that nalahi, they get it right just as often as the older speakers do. These data suggest that younger speakers really do know the meaning of this special morphology. But they have trouble combining this knowledge with the meaning of the rest of the relative clause when the noun is pronounced. And so we'd be interested to hear your thoughts about those ideas in the question period, or the discussion period. Okay, so now let me just summarize. Our results of this discussion on language variation. Language variation is familiar. We all just sort of know that people differ based on who they are as individuals, or their age, or where they're from. People on Rota speak a different variety of Chamorro than people on Saipan or Tinian. And on all three islands, younger people speak a different variety than older people. And unsurprisingly, as some of the slides we've shown you, our research supports these generalizations. But it also reveals some new, unexpected generalizations about the Chamorro used by younger speakers. Younger speakers have trouble understanding questions about who owns or has something. This could be because the Chamorro language has several ways to ask these questions, and younger speakers know only some of them. It could also be because in a question like Hadzi and Penta Traknya, younger speakers have trouble putting together the meaning of Hadzi and Traknya. In other words, they have trouble figuring out that the question is about who owns the truck.
However, younger speakers are just like older speakers in much of their understanding of relative clauses. When the relative clause follows the noun, it modifies. Both younger speakers and older speakers strongly prefer the noun to be the subject. And when the relative clause precedes the noun, it modifies. Both younger speakers and older speakers slightly prefer the noun to be the object.